RPDA. My name is Ruqayyah Abbas-Yusuf, and I'm going to be your chair for this round. With me on panel, would my panelists please introduce themselves if they wish?
Hello everyone. My name is Methembe. I'll be a panelist. All the best to the teams.
Hi everyone.
Okay.
My name is Sandy and I'll be a panelist today. Good luck.
Hi, I'm Irene. I'm a panelist. Good luck.
Hi everyone, my name is Susanna. I'm one of your panelists. Congratulations for making it this far and all the best.
Okay, yeah, I think that's all. All right, thank you very much. So once again, congratulations on making it this far. And that being said, and assuming that we still have all teams on the call, can we have the Prime Minister to start off the debate for us?
All right, thank you. Just to confirm, I'm audible?
Yes, you're audible.
All right, thank you. Let me just set up my timer. Yeah, I'll take points of information, so just feel free to unmute. I hope to be able to take both teams, but yeah, whoever goes first, I'll take you. All right, so my name is Trudeau. I'll be the Prime Minister of the round. Let me just set up my timer. All right, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Arnold, notice the structure of this motion. It doesn't say we shouldn't fund women at all. It says we should determine who gets the vast majority of flagship investment instead of the other. That means a trade-off has to be made, and therefore this debate has to exist on marginal benefit. We think that Gov has the work of showing you that there'll be a huge swing and that these black queens will necessarily get and become much better with any additional investment that we put into the debate. Op can't just tell you that the Black Stars, for example, are very famous or they are still decent, because to keep pouring a lot of investment into a team that has already had a lot of years of priority, they need to prove that this extra investment will necessarily produce a big shift. So we think if we have $1 million and we put that $1 million into the women's sports and they're able to go from being like in the group stage to winning the World Cup, we think that's a much better investment than if Gov have that investment in the Black Stars and they go from simply the group stage to the first out round, right? We think that's extremely important within this debate. Notice that absent of any additional support, these women are unlikely to maintain this status. Why? It's probably likely that the Black Queen's current success is a miracle and it's not structurally ingrained in them. They've not had decades of practice. It's probably likely that they're underdogs within this space and therefore they've had a bit of luck. But beyond that, it depends on a number of handful of exceptional women who are likely overperforming within the sports field. We think in that world, we think if you're unable to invest in this women, any amount of stagnation is highly likely because all other countries are probably investing in their women's sports and that sort of chat. So notice that resources in Ghanaian football and Ghanaian sports are like very rival, right? In general, sports just gets a very little investment in Africa in general. But more importantly, we think the same amount of money, the same cities, you can't really support two flagship projects at once. So what do we support on our world? We think that on our world, we're going to support the fact that a majority of this football investment specifically will go to the Black Queens rather than the Black Stars. So we're okay with maintaining a baseline level of maintenance support for the men's team, but we think the majority of the project that should be treated as a flagship project for the like football in Ghana should be the women's team. This is extremely important within the round. Two things then in my speech. The first thing is on why this gives the Ghanaian it's better investment for money because they have a higher chance of consistent international success per cedi or dollar invested in them. The first premise is very simple. We think moving this investment from the Black Stars towards the Black Queens generates more consistent international success for these women because there is no guarantee of consistency from the women's sports, but there is also no guarantee of consistency from the men's sports in the first place. This is extremely important within this debate because right now the men's team already consume the lion's share of resources. They get the priority, but beyond that, they operate in a highly competitive highly saturated men's game where any sort of marginal benefits are probably going to be tiny, right? Every African side probably has players playing in Europe, Nigeria, South Africa have players playing in the Premier League. They have access to coaches. So any extra $1 million that you spend on the men's team, it doesn't really move the probability of them winning AFCON or the World Cup by a huge margin. On the comparative, if you invest the same $1 million in the women's sports, because they have a low baseline of support in women's football, because that space is continually growing and it's less saturated, meaning if you invest highly in that, you have a marginal impact just in terms of how you're able to benefit them, whether it's in terms of coaching and that sort of thing. You're able to professionalize the women's league because it's likely that these people probably have other side jobs. They don't do this full time. This in turn leads to more consistent performances in the women's AFCON and in the women's World Cup. This is much better of an investment for Ghana as a nation because they get like fast past the post and like they get the priority of a space that's less saturated. They have high likelihood of eventually dominating that space in the future. And I think that's extremely important just in terms of impact, because at stake is who becomes the main producer of Ghana's national pride and football success. In the status quo, the Black Stars are inconsistent. The women's team are far much more consistent. So you're basically they are far much more predictable, and the probability of them getting more World Cup successes and more AFCON successes is much higher. Before I move on to the second argument, I'll take the point of information.
I think that your case is inherently contradictory because you see that they are consistent. Yet again, you see that, they probably win out of luck. How does that necessarily work?
Yeah, they're underdogs. The fact that they've been able to win without support means they're underdogs. That's what I meant. I think it's just an issue of semantics and grammar, right? Anyway, the second argument is very simple. We think that it's likely to make the norms within Ghana much, much better in terms of supporting women's sports and that sort of stuff. Why is this the case? We think when you primarily support the women's sports, just in terms of optics, the Ghanaian government is able to send an important image and an important message towards the Ghanaian sports and Ghanaian women's sports in general. Because right now, for a vast majority of people in Ghana, the message is that this football thing is a male thing. Even if they underperform, we must always consistently invest our resources, invest our narrative, invest our media, like everything towards these individuals. They state the media and sponsors overwhelmingly. They center the Black Stars around the narrative of success in football. We think this reinforces the idea that this national pride and this national investment is a reserve of the men's team, independent of how the women's team are able to perform. We think when the government is able to move more money towards the women's team, they're able to change the norms and they're able to signal a better shift in the norms because they say that women's sports is equally worthy of that national investment. We think this changes the calculation of a lot of women and girls within the families and in a lot of communities because these people probably are able to see that a lot of women can get the national support from the government. So they move more people within that sport. Inherently, this leads to more long-term impact that necessarily builds off of each other because you get more women getting into those sports because you signal a shift within the country that you can equally prioritize the black queens within the sports in protected time. The last thing then is just in terms of why this marginal investment within these women is extremely important at this particular specific duration of time. Notice it's not likely that this success could be maintained for a long time absent of this support. They've been consistent, but they've been consistent as a result of probably they're outliers or they're like extremely good people within that league. It's unlikely that these people will persist for the next 15 to 20 years. So this is a unique opportunity that Ghana has to be able to invest in its women, become the ones who are get into a market that's not very saturated, be able to be the ones who are dominating the women's football league, and that's like very important within this debate. So we think that norm shift is probably going to make this asymmetric norm shift of moving the money from the men's sports to the women's sports is extremely important in terms of just making sure that you're able to get some level of marginal benefit, but also in terms of changing the norms within the country we're proud to propose.
We thank the Prime Minister for that speech. Can we have Elo to start off the case for the opposition bench?
All right, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Please, I'll begin shortly. All right, so POIs, just unmute and state your team role. That is, if it's COO or prioritize CO for short diagonal engagement. All right, I begin my speech I hope because there's like a slight noise in the background. I hope I'm perfectly audible. But guys, just give me a sec.
Yes, you're audible.
All right. I begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel. It is not the fault of the Black Queens. It is not the fault of the Black Stars. It is not the fault of the Ghanaian Football Association that women's football internationally doesn't have as much recognition, or isn't as lucrative, or isn't as economically like the best way to invest heavily right now. We think there are a couple of reasons why what opening government proposes are problematic on a pragmatic level, and then my partner is going to tell you more how they engage at a principal level of optics and all of that stuff. We think that what happens right now is that the men's football even demands a lot more funds, demands a lot more funding. Hiring male coaches in the market is more expensive. Hiring the kind of training gear that you probably need for the male sport is inflated because of how like competitive and how lucrative the male sport is, particularly all this kind of international competitions, the World Cup, African Cup of Nations, all of these kinds of things make these like section of sports, the male sport, inherently even much more expensive to maintain, inherently much more expensive to try to even get marginal results. A couple of things in my speech. One, I'm going to characterize how the Black Queens look like and how they get funding. Second, I'm going to talk a bit about the Black Stars. Then 2 arguments, financial relevance, and lastly, best case scenario for opening government side. I want to talk about the Black Queens because they say from OG they support a baseline level of funding for them. We for the Black Stars, we support a baseline level of funding for the Black Queens, which means that there will be funding, but not necessarily as heavily as OG wants. A couple of characterizations. The first thing to understand is the fact that we don't think the problem in the status quo is necessarily like the amount of funding. Based off of the economic principles are aligned to you about how the male funding needs a lot more investment and how it's more expensive to maintain. I think the problem, which can be solved on our side, is how we don't necessarily have like these African countries sticking to what has been demanded of them as regards to how frequent that baseline funding comes, which looks like them not necessarily being paid regularly, right? It's not necessarily the case of, giving them more money. It's about giving them the money periodically when it ought to have come or when it ought to have been disbursed. What does this look like on our side? It looks like how we have international organizations like FIFA, like CAF, having a certain portion that you're supposed to give to these women, or a certain portion you're supposed to give to them, and these countries, their associations also have that. What happens that I think is the flaw is that often these portions, even though they are minimal, like the info slide says, don't come as periodically as they should. We think that this is something that could happen, but we don't think we have to now invest a lot more or add additional money to that baseline. Second thing, we think it is also crucial that companies also and private sponsorship happens for these particular women. The difference, though, and the reason why it is preferable or why this private sponsorship is even much more plausible on their side is one, because of how low cost the women football is even more of an incentive for private companies to come in to invest in these kind of scenarios or in these kind of instances. But 2, because of the fact that some of these companies, they're not going after the global perception of like investing in the Black Stars, want to look more socially conscious. That's why they are more likely to be keen to invest in these kind of spaces or want to draw their attention to these kind of places. I'll tell you how they come shortly because you may not get that in a bit. But thirdly, and this is also falls to the principle, we think that what happens on our side is where we can give these women the performance prizes that they win, the performance prizes that they get from their good performances when they do get that. Because OG says they wouldn't be consistent. On our side of the house, even when they are consistent, they can get the full performance prizes that they get and they can win to invest in that. But then the last thing that allows me to segue to my next point is how these women's sports aren't necessarily as inflated as the men's sports. What does the Black Stars football look like? Number one, the fact that these particular people are individually talented and are able, because of their stardom, to get a lot of recognition to how we perceive like the sporting and footballing in Ghana. But secondly, beyond football, these stars are also able to bring that kind of like perception to Ghana, where we see people like Mohammed, Kudus in Tottenham, Thomas Partey, all of these things, where we saw in the year of return in 2019. All these tourist drives, all these tourism moves that they are able to sponsor, they are able to support, that brings a lot of recognition to the Ghanaian government. But thirdly, and this is very crucial, it looks like how we have the Male World Cup, the African Cup of Nations, having a lot more recognition and having a lot more like importance in the international space. And also lastly, it looks like how a lot of these men also support and push for like women's sport. We saw Jordan Ayew, for instance, supporting women's sports and pushing for more recognition in these spaces. This is how they look like, and this is why we need to sustain them. what are the impacts you get from sustaining them? I'm going to talk about it briefly before I explain explicitly. Number one, you continuously allow this particular, this positive shaping of the global perception of Ghanaian football. But secondly, you also allow them to be able to get to that level of stardom to continuously bring in the more tourism like you probably get, and also voice out more for women's football. Let's talk about the financial part about this debate. The first thing you need to understand is that you're making a financial risk and you're making a financial mistake when you invest more in women's sports. Because one, you take away, because they say you invest more heavily, you take away the kind of funding that the men teams need to be sustainable, to be as sustainable as it demands now, where there are a lot of competition in the international men's space. Remember, I told you men's football is a lot more expensive to maintain, male coaches, all of that. But more importantly, your competitors are also investing more heavily. The South Africans, the Nigerians, the Norwegians, all of those other European countries where male football is even advancing at a very fast level, where they don't just depend only on talent, but high-tech technology to train their players. It means that in men's sport already, the bar is already very high. You need a lot more investment to be able to catch up, to even have a level of recognition. Comparatively, in women's sport, it's not necessarily the same thing, and it's no fault of anyone in the Ghanaian FA or in Ghana that is what happens. In that particular line, you just have to be as good as you are, as the info slide says. You don't necessarily need as much of an investment to excel or to be as brilliant. I'm going to take that POI.
Yeah. So if men's sport already has a lot of people in funding, right, and then that therefore means the men's space is saturated, which means then you have a tiny marginal impact. But when you invest in the women's sport, there's a huge marginal impact for the same amount of money.
Not necessarily. But second, not necessarily, because when you invest more in the men's sport, you're able to catch up with your competitors that are already going far above you, and because of the fact that they need that to be to even get to that level of consistency, your other competitors in the male sport are getting farther. Best case scenario for their side of the house, they give women win more competitions. The problem is internationally, it still isn't necessarily comparative economically. If a woman team wins WAFCON, like I said, it's not their fault. They probably will get the same kind of prize money as a male team that gets to the quarterfinals of the World Cup or the quarterfinals of AFCON, or even just participates in the group stages. We don't think that makes any sense comparatively. But secondly, we think in many instances, the extra revenue we even get from the male sports is often what is even disbursed back to the female bank. But lastly, I think what happens on their side of the house is that you starve the male team of even the possibility or the potential of excelling or scaling up as they probably would, because of the fact that they have shown some level of brilliance and some level of consistency that allows them to catch up with their peers internationally that are continuously increasing in level of competition. What you must take in this debate, number one, is how sadly the women's sport isn't necessarily as lucrative, which means it's not as financially inflated, but the male sport comparatively is. It means you need a lot more investment, coaches, training equipment, but also to catch up with the other teams, other countries that are getting farther in that particular field. Eziel will do more. Proud.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, I'll ask for your POIs. My name is Zephyr. I'm going to be DPM. I'm going to be starting my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I don't think you get any improvement of the male team when you allow them to have a monopoly of all the benefits. That is to say, a person is unlikely to become a better judge for so long as they're aware that no matter what they do throughout the tournament, they're definitely going to be finals chair. I think there's a large inertia to succeed in the men's team because they're already immensely glorified to an extent that's vastly unproportional to what they invest in. What does a lot of the extra funding look like? Because Opens doesn't want to admit this. These people tend to have high extent of branding events, high extent of bonuses, lots of marketing, lots of merchandise, lots of pushes and whatnot. And the problem when you give somebody a prize without achievements and you don't follow the laws of meritocracy is that they don't have the incentive to put in the work. I think this is vastly problematic for two reasons. One, Collins makes this claim that women tend to rely on the benefits and the returns from male sports. But I think Trudeau already proves to you that male sports don't really have much of a return. A lot of this return is from things such as sales in merchandise and broadcasting rights and all call that leasing, or maybe when they win a championship. But when a team doesn't consistently do well, people don't want to associate with it. So they are not buying the merchandise, they're not watching the matches. So there's not much of a buyout from the male team, simply because it hasn't achieved anything important in the past few decades. We think this is vastly a lie and an over-exaggeration of male appeal and literally misogyny at this point. I think there are two problems here. One, you have a high extent of fan frustration because there's a lot of bad investment in a shit team. That is to say, because fans generally have a proximity to money, they're aware of the fact that it ought to be invested in the best possible person. I think two, you're just reducing fans' investment in sports. That is to say, because you're consistently pushing out this team to them, literally to their faces about the benefits of the Ghanaian national team, you're intuitively connecting the name and brand of the nation to this bad team and whatnot. We think they're unlikely to want to associate with it. But I think let me just prove why we get a return on investment. I think Collins is a liar once again, because there's a high extent of infrastructure into women's sports in literally every state. That's why currently we hear more pushes about what the Arsenal women's team is doing. Perhaps because their male team is shit. But still, you have pushes of what, good things happen in the African team. There's already a high investment into women's sports broadcasting for two reasons. One, there's a high level of demand and interest. Funny story, people aren't that misogynistic anymore, especially even if they are. Yes?
DPM. Yeah. I'm so sorry. I got disconnected at the beginning of your speech. Could you kindly just restart?
God forgive me. Okay, sure. Oh no. Could I have like a minute to rewrite? I don't write good notes. Okay. I'm going to start my speech. Therefore, in 3, 2, 1. I think the first thing to prove is how we make the males team better. When you give somebody a monopoly of prize, that is a monopoly of benefit. For example, somebody can judge a tournament in a shit way or not put in their best possible effort, but they're still going to be finals chair because of a perhaps preference for male judges and whatnot, and they're the only male judge in the tournament. You create a lot of problems in society in that they have a lower inertia to succeed. If I know I'm going to consistently succeed because I'm a woman and get best female speaker in a tournament, that means I'm vastly unlikely to put in a high extent of effort to achieve the best possible scenario. That is when you have a monopoly of success. What does this look like? These men teams get to have high bonuses, high marketing, lots of important branding events. You're giving them a prize without necessarily making them work for it. I think one, you have a high extent of buyout from fans, simply because they are frustrated that their country name and their country identity is consistently tied to a bad team, and we think they're more likely to dissociate from this. I think this directly handles Collins' argument on why women benefit from sports, because Trudeau already proves to you the fact that most people don't already associate with Ghanaian male team just because it doesn't do very well. It's the same case of African people tending to support European teams over their own home teams when their home teams don't tend to do so well. And why say Uganda now has a high interest in their national team because the national team started doing well. People don't like to associate with losers, and therefore you're not going to have the good merchandise sales. These people have not won. The Ghanaian national team has not won a sensible thing in like decades at this point. That's the male team. At that point in time, you're not getting money from brand sales, you're not getting money from merchandise. You're literally just consistently investing in the male team because you're told that's what you're supposed to do, and it's supposed to create a level of buying. It's literally burning cash at this point in time. We don't agree with that. I think that's A. But B, how do we get a return on investment on our side? I think that's a high extent of infrastructure already being invested into women's sports. That is to say, you have them gaining high extents of broadcasting rights. You have already a high level of demand and interest. There's already a global interest in women's sports at this point. I think the most important example would be looking at European leagues, yes. But understand, the reason we are now recognizing things like Arsenal women's team and whatnot is already because there's a high investment into these women's teams to ensure a high level of success that they obtain. But two, there's a high extent of collaboration. So the moment they decide they want to invest in the women's team, there are already structures in place pushing for the success of women's sports. But I think people don't necessarily, one sec, love, people don't necessarily resonate with men. It's not that I like men. It's like I like the fact that there are so many narratives about success that tend to surround them. The moment men start to be shit, you want to dissociate with them. I think there's a need, there's a sort of, people tend to want to set their desire. I think a lot of people are going to rush towards support of the women's team in the event that it achieves a high level of success simply because they've been starved of associating with a champion. Think of it this way. Even if you have a misogynistic debate space and the men are not really winning any tournaments, if one woman comes and starts winning tournaments, everyone who want to associate with her, everyone who want to ensure she gets the best coaches. Because at the most important thing, you care about the identity and safety. People associate with men because we assume they have a high probability of success in sports. At the point that they don't, we think they're more likely to want to support the women's team, just as Arsenal supporters are forced to support their women's team. I think this is also really important for Ghana. Like, when you improve the face of Ghanaian sports by putting women in the center, you're literally building a more positive identity at the end of the day. So I think you're still going to get all the benefits of being associated with a good sports team, as well as reducing all the branding and the exposure of your shit men's team. I'm going to take a point. Yes.
First of all, Ghanaians are not misogynistic, so our case is not misogynistic. But secondly, you have a huge logical leap in your case that investment equals performance. And if Ghanaians necessarily do not like women,
Okay,
then
that's
your
15 minutes.
merchandise that they will
I
buy
think
from
this is quite
women.
important to say. Collins lies when he tells you that male coach is expensive. I don't think the case is that male coach is expensive. I think it's good coaches are expensive. So when you have more investment, you have improved performance, you have better understanding of their strategies, better understanding of their skills. Not that the Ghanaian men team already has a high investment in them. Even if we replace their coach today at this point in time, they've still learned a lot of valid information from them, which they are too dumb to even apply, and that's why they are losing. On our side of the house, you have a lot of space to saturate the women's ability in regards to giving them equipment, trainings, ensuring that, monitoring their meals, etc. But I think if Ghanaians are not misogynistic, then why the hell are they supporting the women's team anyway at that point in time? I think you're a liar, just like your teammates. I think the next chat then is to prove the burdens on opposition side, because opposition can't just say that when we reduce funding, when our side reduces funding, the male team is going to go to shit. I think there's already a basic investment in them, but I think two, they're already shit anyway, so you're not getting that much delta from them to that specific regard. I think one, you have to tend to apply the laws of meritocracy, and this is just a principle I'm debating at this point. We think one, in every sports field and in every sports structure, you have to exercise the post of merit. This is going to directly engage with whatever Eziel says. Because Eziel is going to say principally it has to be garbage. I mean, like, principally, you have to give it to the place whereby you're going to get the highest level of regard because you're helping the women's team when the male merchandise sells. But I've already told you that men aren't bringing much return on profit anyway. I think at that point in time, you're principally justified to resort to a level of meritocracy whereby you're ensuring that the women get the highest exposure. Not only is this more likely to increase a high level of urgency in the male team to up their game simply because they're now being compared to like a women's team and therefore have a scale of competition that is say you're no longer the celebrities of Ghana just by virtue of being on the male team, but you're also more likely going to create a high extent of benefit and a high level of appreciation from the women's team, making them more likely to work harder. The principle of sports is not that you give Usain Bolt the medal because he's going to get the highest level of attention. You give him the medal when he does the best possible job. I'm going to take a POI from closing if at any given point there is one. Opening. All right. At that point in time, what have you been doing? Yeah?
Yeah, so on your side, do you collapse the Black Stars?
We don't collapse the Black Stars. Pano, in the event that said Trudeau is a better debater than me and he has consistently had the best coaches and whatnot, even if I take away from him the coaches, because maybe he has been doing a bad job, he still knows the content of debate. He still understands a basic level of strategy. He still has built and had specific structures in place that are going to aid him. Even if we remove funding from these people, we are not doing it entirely. They maintain skeletal funding. They maintain access to equipment, access to competitions and whatnot. We are not completely defunding them. A vast majority of the money that we are raising from these people is more in regards to like brand deals, more in regards to a lot of that exposure that they tend to get, which already doesn't resonate well because you're exposing people who aren't that much successful. We think at that point in time, there's a lot of retained talent that they're still going to have, but B, there's a lot of now high investment just principally by meritocracy that you're ensuring that the women's team obtains. The most important thing to remember is we don't associate with men, we associate with champions. With that, I rest.
Thank you, DPM, for that fine speech. We now welcome DLO to wrap up the case for the opening.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Just a couple of caveats before I start the round. First of all, I acknowledge that there's a majority female panel here, and I also don't think labeling our team as misogynistic is quite fair to us. I think this is something I'll take up with equity later. But then I just want to flag it out because this is an out round and no judge is supposed to vote against us because just one team thinks that we are misogynistic without giving structural proof why that is so. Yeah. So let me move on to my speech proper. All right, great. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. At the top of Collins' speech, he proves to you why we are deeply so sad that it is not because of state's fault that women's football lack a lot of return on investment globally within status quo. And these are capitalistic structures beyond the hands of state. That means that you cannot say that when we give you the factual realities of what exists on the ground, we are misogynistic within the debate. But I'm also going to give you a lot of contextual framing because I'm a Ghanaian and I have a lot of context that these people do not have. And even though we try to flag a lot of this context within opening opposition, lead of up speech, majority of it goes unengaged. And that's why opening government is disingenuous and they are not going to win the debate. First of all, even if you are not Ghanaian, you know that Ghana is going through an economic hardship. It is cutting government spending to focus on things like industrialization, things like infrastructure development. So recently in our national budget reading, which happened like two days ago, you had massive funding being allocated to things like the big push, all those other stuff. What this means is that most times the monetary like incentive available to fund sports on a very huge level has been cut within most of those instances. And you need to recognize that Ghana as a country, and even most countries that do football, do not receive external funding from anywhere. What this means is that any little money that goes into sports must have the potential to replicate and create a model that sustains itself and sustains the Ministry of Sport so that it can be able to create accessibility for all the diverse people that exist within sport, whether you are trans, whether you are a woman, whether you are whatever, to get access to those infrastructure in order to succeed. What this means is that when you are investing as an investor, you need to look at which model gives you the highest return on investment, but which one creates a world where you are able to overcome all those operational costs so that you are able to get a net utility and a net profit to sustain the Ministry of Sport so that it's able to sustain the very subsidiaries under that Ministry of Sport to protect the very teams that exist. What we say, and this is common sense, because Collins tells you that structurally within the global space, even if the Black Queens are able to win the Women's World Cup, at best, they get $2 million, which is what Nigeria got when they won the Women's World Cup. But if we play in the group stage as even Ghana within the World Cup that we've qualified in as Black Stars, we get about $25 million just from revenue sales and just from bonuses that FIFA gives you. What this shows you that even at the best, where we are very shitty and we lose and we don't qualify from the group stage, we get much more money than the women's team that wins the World Cup, because necessarily that is how the gamified system of sport and football has been in status quo. They need to prove that when we change this funding structure from state, it then changes the global structure for them to get all their benefits on the return of investment and everything they tell you on their side to win. Insofar as they don't do that from opening government, their ripple effect case logically falls. Secondly, it is a bad investment because then they don't do any minimax. The opportunity cost is high on their side of the house. And this is why they lose the debate, because they say it should be based on meritocracy. The only merit an investor cares about is how they're able to get profits to sustain that investment and sustain that machinery. Insofar as we prove to you that we have more merit on our side of the house in terms of getting much more investment, but in terms of the person that you invest in has more merit in generating more funds for you, then Black Stars needs to be invested. We don't think this debate is about gender pay gap. This debate is about we structurally hating women. I'll take you later. Because structurally, Collins goes an extra mile to prove to you that most times the things that the Black Queens need to stay afloat in terms of operational cost all those other stuff, paying them and all those other things are massively catered for by the state. And I think Trudeau, even in his PM speech, recognizes that this debate is not about whether the Black Queens will collapse or the Black Stars will collapse. All of them will be able to compete. It's about an extra support that exists and who should it go to and how do we yield much more benefit. We prove that on our side of the house. So conversations about, well, this is misogynistic, this is against women, all those other stuff necessarily does not fall within this debate, because there's a huge burden again on GAF to prove that insofar as they are able to push funding to Black Queens is massively going to succeed, and that growth is going to be exponential. Because buying from their same logic that the male sports are sports and they are very lazy and they are complacent because they have much more funding in status quo, that means that if we also go and fund the Black Queens will also become complacent and they will also fail, and you don't get all that benefit. That means that at best, it is a wash on their side of the house if they want to claim that it is because of excess funding, that's why people become lazy and do not perform on that side of the house. And that is why you cannot buy. I'm largely deconstructing OG so that you know that OG cannot win this debate on any other front from any angle in which you are going to judge this debate. Shoot your POI.
If it is true that the women's sports gets $2 million on winning and the men's sports gets $25 million, then as an investor, why would I invest in a lower probability of them getting that 25 million? I mean, they're competing with Germany and the USA and all of those, but the women's sports have already demonstrated that they can win.
Trudeau, I think you need hearing aids, because I analyzed to you that even if we lose within the group stages of the World Cup that Ghana Black Stars has already qualified from, we get much more money than your best case, where you are able to even win the entire tournament on your side. So we don't even have to be efficient. We don't even have to be genius. We just have to be shitty, show our beautiful faces as Black Stars to those places, and get more return on investment than you. And that's why you're losing the debate comparatively. But here is why none of the teams is beating us on the principle. Why? Because notice that the biggest principle that can come from GAF is to say we are disenfranchising women, we are marginalizing women. But notice that state allocates limited resources from the frame that I give to you. And choosing to invest strategically is not an ethical violation, because if we expand things like police intelligence units, we are not disenfranchising the fire service. If we support cocoa modernization, we are not marginalizing share farmers. We think public investment involves prioritization, and that prioritization is not a moral injury. The principle that lack of increased investment equals oppression is impossible to defend on GAF, because it forces OG and CG to say that unless government maximizes women's football funding above all other alternatives, it is inherently sexist. This is a moral claim they cannot sustain, because it criminalizes every budget decision that exists. And that means that everything should go to minorities, because if you don't prioritize them, that means you are outrightly sexist and misogynistic and every other thing they tell you. But most importantly, Collins goes a step further to prove to you that most of the machinery that sustains most of these minority sports and all those other stuff to keep them afloat mostly comes from the huge investments where investment returns that we are able to get from most of these football leagues. Most of these Black Stars and most of these guys don't even have to be brilliant. They don't even have to be exceptional. By mere fact that the capitalistic system that exists in sport have structured the systems in a way that even if they are shitty, they're able to get much more return on investment than these women. We are able to get that at a state, looking at the tipping point I analyzed to you at the top of my speech, in order to trickle down to most of these women to protect them. So if it's about accessibility, operational cost to keep the Black Queens afloat, and all those other things, you need to buy our case before you are able to buy their sustainability and everything. But on their side of the house, comparatively, even that $2 million cannot offset all the operational cost and everything that most of these women get. At best, you get little net profit, which you cannot use to expand accessibility to stadiums and all those other things that exist for most of these minorities. See, we are not the ones that cause the football field to be misogynistic. We are not the ones that cause the football field to not say we are not going to pay a lot of women. No state can inherently change it by saying that, well, I'm funding more women than men. It is an investment decision to sustain the machinery of the state, sustain its sports ministry so that it can perpetuate to sustain all other subsidiaries. We think that insofar as most of these women benefit from the investment that exists on their side of the house, we are happy to do that. You cannot vote against that because any team says we are misogynistic. Incredibly proud.
Thank you, Diallo, for that fine speech, and thank you for bringing us to the end of the opening house. We now invite the member of government to start off the closing half of the debate.
Okay, can I be heard?
Yes, you can.
Okay, so I'm in a very tight space, so I may not be able to take POIs because literally I don't have a structured note. So if you ask a POI, I might just disorient everything. So I beg. Jeffrey will deal with the POIs later. Okay. So in case you can't hear me or anything, kindly notify me. And also I don't have anything to time myself, so kindly interrupt me when my time is up, right? All right. So I'm going to start my speech now. So panel, let me add the dimension this debate has been missing that will be sufficient for us to break in the room. The question is not just which team deserves investment. It is which teams transform Ghana's football ecosystem, and that's where we strategically enter a siege. Because the Black Stars operate inside a system that has been captured by years of political interference, inflated budget, corrupt intermediaries, and institutional complacencies. Thank God Eziel is not the only Ghanaian here. Because every CD poured into that system reinforces the very actors who keep holding Ghana back. The Black Queens, however, have operated outside these entrenched networks. Their structure is lean, it is meritocratic and responsive because of the same unattractiveness these guys preach. This means that heavy investment does not just improve them, it rewires the incentives inside the Ghana Football Association itself. Administrators now must shift expertise. Development programs follow the money. Coaching standard needs to be modernized. Media scrutiny will rise. Corrupt actors lose their grip because they no longer control the most important team in the country. This structural reset will spill over into the men's team as well. I'll prove that in my second extension because better governance, training pipelines, and talent development benefit all players regardless of sexes, right? Only our side creates a future where Ghana's football succeeds sustainably, and that's why we are different from our opening. Let me paint the central problem more because our opening didn't do this. We think that Ghana has built a football economy that rewards underperformance in men's football and punishes excellence in women's football. The Black Stars are trapped in a system that absorbs money without reform. The Black Queens are trapped in a system that delivers value but receives none. The root cause is institutional capture. That is why this is happening. Why? Because over 20 years, the men's system formed powerful administrative networks that feed on prestige, sponsorship, and political attention. These networks cannot correct themselves because their survival depends on keeping investment flowing into the same broken channels. The women's system is not successful because it has more talent. No, it is successful because it has fewer gatekeepers. That's the same reason why we want to remove those gatekeepers in the men's team. So in the world, right, under status quo, it looks like two different football industries. One that is bloated, politicized, and stubborn, the other that is lean, merit-focused, and desperate for the level of support it really deserves. So the incentives that arise from this are very dangerous because every CD that you pour into the Black Stars give administrators a reason to preserve the old problems. Every CD denied to the Black Queen signals that excellence in women in sports does not even matter in the first place. All try to convince you that we are making an economic mistake or we are weakening the men's team. And they told us that the market picks winners and that we should follow that. That story fails because it assumes the football marketplace is neutral in itself. It is not. It is shaped by decades of skilled investment that created a trap system which money alone cannot fix. Let me end this framing with a contrast. The award keeps pouring resources into a broken system and hopes something changes. Our award directs investment where performance and discipline already exist and reshapes the entire football future of Ghana. It's a choice between repeating history or building a new one. Panel, I would decide with building a new one. Eziel, take your time. I'll take you. I'm coming. First thing, why we think shifting major investment to the Queens change how Ghanaian institutions behave. Understand this first reason. We think that when you direct large budgets, sponsorships, and national attention to a team that has not been captured by entrenched networks, in which Eziel will agree because he's also Ghanaian, you weaken the actors who thrive on the Black Stars' bloated finances because there have already been times where Ghanaian citizens are causing for these cuts because it's too much. They lose relevance because control follows money. committees, administrators, and even high-level decision makers must now focus on the women's program, where there's like less room for patronage for these people. That forces governance practices to shift. Second thing is that the growth of the Queens attracts new scrutiny. Media sponsors, civil society will start monitoring spending because it's a new territory. Women's sports will attract development partners who demand transparency and measurable impact. This creates incentives for cleaner accounting, modern training systems, and stricter oversight. Once this culture is established, it pressures the wider GFA to adopt the same standards. What's the mechanism? Here's how the change will happen. Because money flows to the Queens. That forces administrative capacity, expert coaching, and international partnerships to follow these things. Once those actors enter the women's ecosystem, they demand modern systems, right? They expect athlete management software, data tracking, transparency, player selection, and long-term development planning. This technological and administrative upgrade then spreads across the entire GFA because no institution can create two opposite standards. The Black Stars inherits the improvements because the infrastructure becomes unified. Why is this consequential in the debate? We think that this argument win because all assumes that the status quo structure remains unchanged. We show that the structure collapses and rebuilds itself around performance and transparency. This gives Ghana football a long-term path none of the other benches can deliver.
POI.
So the delta is simple. In their world, the same people stay in charge and waste money. In our world, investment into the Queen becomes the trigger for institutional removal in and out of itself. Let me talk about why we think women's team generates a developmental spillover that men's team cannot. Let me take your POI before I move on.
This is why your case outrightly loses the debate, because you assume that when Mahama says we are going to fund more women's sports, it means that we are going to change the Minister of Sport, the GFA president, all those other things.
That's not the point. That's not the point. See, it is not only the sports minister and the minister of sports. Abedi Pele, old players, individual private partnership, they all polarize and politicize these things, right? We are removing them in and out of itself. That marginal benefit is important. Understand that investments in the Queens expand the grassroots pipelines because girls and families who previously saw football as an inaccessible now see real institutional backing. But this also increases participation rates and also widens the talent pool for decades, right? Men's football already has that situation. Women football does not. That means that marginal benefit in itself wins that. But then secondly, we think that women football draws that different partnerships like health NGOs, education ministers, gender equality programs, humanitarian agencies to invest in women's sports as part of their broader development work. So these actors bring facilities and equipment and training programs that spill over into the general community sports because infrastructure is shared. All cannot access this because they claim the market must decide. We show that the social development returns great value beyond commercial sponsorship. Our world gives Ghana a deeper talent base, a more educated sporting community, and better infrastructure in and out of itself, right? Even if Op says that women's football is not economically strong enough to justify this, we answer that by saying that economic strength emerges from broader participation, not from waiting for stardom to appear. Investment is the cause of market growth and not the response in itself. Our bench shows you one thing OG could not. Investing in the Queens does not only improve performance or express fairness, it resets incentives inside Ghanaian football. It breaks the capture of the Black Star system. It modernizes the entire football pipeline. It widens participation in deeper infrastructure. It creates long-term national success, not fragile cycles of hope and disappointment. O cannot touch this because they defend the old system. CO cannot outrun this because no alternative extension changes institutions as deeply as ours do. Our world gives you Ghana, that's a Ghana Football Association ecosystem that finally live up to its potential. The award keeps Ghana trapped in the same circle of frustration, proud to break from the show.
Thank you, Member of Government, for that speech. Member of Opposition, ready when you are.
Can I be heard?
Yes, you can.
Okay. If you have a POI, kindly unmute and ask. If I am not able to take you, however, Isaac will definitely give you some work. Yeah. All right. Let me start the speech then in 3, 2. Sorry, my timer. I almost forgot. Just a second. Great. So I'm starting this speech then in 3, 2, one. Let's first deal with closing government here. So closing government's biggest push is that corrupt politicians necessarily hijack most of these budget investment and infrastructure deals within the Black Stars. The problem, however, is that they fail to recognize that the massive funding that will be pushed within, into the Black Queens would also still be handled by corrupt officials. We think that corruption on their side is one that is largely minimized because there isn't enough money to steal. When you push those enough money to steal, those same corruption structures that they identify for the Black Stars would significantly exist on their end. We think that the debate in the opening half has necessarily been, one, should we fund the Black Stars because the Black Stars are better? Or two, should we fund the Black Queens because the Black Queens are better? Opening government says the Black Queens are better, so we should fund them. What we are going to do from closing opposition is to show you why this massive investments is something that significantly harms the Black Queens and their performance and their sustainability in the longer run. But from opening opposition to closing opposition, we are going to show you why national identity is something that is significantly important. Let's engage in the debates then. Notice that the Black Stars are huge within Ghana because they generate huge emotional and commercial reach, while the Black Queens represent things like resilience and efficiency despite the low economic support that they get. We think from closing opposition that you cannot simply trade one value, i.e. resilience and efficiency, for the other without harming overall football structure. The reason why this is important is because notice that Ghana isn't just about who wins, or football in Ghana isn't just about who wins, but the emotional infrastructure that necessarily supports millions of young people and dreams, local jobs, and even national pride. That heavy shift in funding will risk destabilizing this entire ecosystem rather than improving it, right? A couple of arguments, then two extensions from closing opposition to be precise. The first is on how this necessarily harms the Black Queens in the long term. Notice that there is a general concession within the debate that the Black Stars are shitty. But why are they still being funded is the question that we need to interrogate. We think that the Black Stars are constantly being funded within the status quo because there is massive national internal support and recognition for most of these people, meaning that the government constantly wants to help make the Black Stars better, and that is why they always have incentives to consistently fund the Black Stars, i.e. media backlash for the Black Stars to necessarily improve. That's something that is significantly lesser for the Black Queens. But then secondly, it means that there is a problem. That's national internal support and recognition for the women is significantly weaker. And these are problems that funding just does not fit. You cannot just shift years of historical emotional attachments because of funds. Meaning, one, incentives to maintain that much funding, i.e. internal media and public pressure, bureaucratic force, media backlash, all these things disappear. Couple that with how, one, they were already performing with minimal funds. Two, that narrative necessarily shifts. It means then that regardless of the wins that you can get for the Black Queens when you massively invest, that Black Stars will lose and that massive internal support wouldn't necessarily be as strong. It means that when you do this on your side, your policy is one that is unsustainable. Why? Because this is inherently a political decision to invest, and political decisions sways with public sentiment. Why this is important is because in the longer run, given there is minimum internal push for funding to be sustained, and given that's already proves why the returns are significantly lower, it means that funding ultimately dries out in the long term. Why is this significantly terrible? The first is that you end up destroying the Black Queens in themselves long term. Why? Because rather than increasing their wages, you decrease their wages. You decrease their incentives to necessarily perform well. You increase the demotivation. This means the decreasing incentives to maintain performance because the players will be reluctant to play as a form of protest of necessarily you decreasing their support. But secondly, they are now used they are not used to a certain standard that you have set for them before, and so ripping away this makes it significantly difficult to maintain their consistent performances. The comparative on our side is better because we don't massively shift all resources to the Black Queens and take it away gradually. But what we do is that you can minimally increase the resource funding marginally, but then it means that the women are appreciative. They will be consistent. This proves that on our side, long term, we sustain the women's team better. We don't think that massive funding is something that is necessary. But second argumentation and why this extension is significantly more important. Notice that the Black Stars are a symbol of national pride and African excellence. You don't think of African football without thinking about Black Stars. Why is this true? They have a huge historical significance. They are the oldest, most decorated, globally recognized in things like one, their AFCON dominance. Two, their World Cup performances. Look at the 2010 quarterfinal run. Phenomenal. multi-generational legacies have been passed on by fathers, mothers, and grandparents. This creates deep emotional attachment and cultural memory. But secondly, they are Pan-African symbolism. They are easier to recognize. Things that their name, the Black Stars, the flag, the jersey is easily recognizable. They are pioneers of this sport. Black Stars, regardless of their current performance, act as a cultural reference point for African football excellence. We think that they get things like massive diaspora identity, where you get massive things like watch parties, things like tourism hikes when it comes to most of these performances, cultural merchandise and brand identities. That symbolism of itself of national pride is something that we need to preserve. But notice that Ghana is also entering one of the most socially fragile periods in its democratic history. Right now, three forces are converging: high cost of living, massive youth unemployment, low trust in political institutions. We think that these are the exact structural ingredients that historically lead to polarization, populism, and ethnic entrenchment in things like fragile democracies like Ghana. When economic and political fluctuation spikes, the populations naturally shift towards strong ethnic identities, religious blocs, or even political tribalism. These shifts raise the risk of real social fractures. This is not abstract. This is the exact trajectory that Ghana is on. In such periods, society survives because of stability or stable institutions, and the Black Stars are one of the last remaining ones. Why is this important? A stable institution is something that creates national emotional investment, transcends political and ethnic divisions, and absorbs social frustration. This reminds citizens that they belong to one Ghana and as a pressure valve during the crisis, which means that the Black Stars are single most powerful one because they unite NPP and NDC voters. They unite Christians and Muslims. They unite North and South. They create mass collective emotion, joy, grief, hope. That is not segmented. That cannot be replicated by the Black Queens in the status quo because national identity institutions are historical, not manufactured, which means that if you defund them, you harm this global and national identity in that particular regard. But second thing on impact on the sports sector. Notice that Africa constantly loses most of its players to the West and Europe. When you defund the Black Stars, you give these players little incentives to play for their country because they know that the country doesn't even support them. We don't think you need to do this. For national identity and sustainability of the women, we are proud.
Thank you, Emma, for that fine speech. Government whip.
Jeffrey, I just want to be sure if you take us.
Can I be heard?
Yes, you can.
Oh, okay, very nice. Let me set my time. Johnson, I'll not take you. You're losing the debates. I won't take you. All right. Let me start. I'll start in my next word. See, there is a contention within the debates, right? It looks like a world where Griffith already solved that problem. The contention is quite simple. We agree to the fact that, government is not the one that is supposed to be held accountable for women's sports that is literally failing. We agree to the contest from opening opposition. What we say in response to that is that currently within status quo, the women's sports in itself is one that is suffering. But most importantly, the Black Stars in itself is something that is state captured for a couple of contextual reasons. One, because of corruption that exists within the African Ghanaian football system. A lot of these things have become noticed to the public eye. Things like calling out coaches and calling out even executives that are literally mismanaging money. Things like going to World Cup and literally spending money without actually giving the Black Stars these kind of incentives to play. We've seen players coming to report these instances, and when they report these instances, these people literally sack them out of the team. We want to fix the system. In our world, we want to also elevate women's sports, but also making sure that that national prestige that CEO wants to preach is still gotten in our world. How do we do that? Griffith tells you that there is a level of state capture when it comes to men's football in Ghana currently, right? How do we solve that? We think in our world, what you then do is that, one, when you fund the Black Stars, you recreate the structure in itself. How does that literally look like in principle? It looks like, one, giving much attention to the Black Stars. Why is that important? It's because of the traction that exists within social media when it comes to sports. Why is that matter? It looks like a world where, one, see, when the Black Stars, Black Queen starts to perform, right? It means that, one, a lot of conversations are being surrounded when it comes to these Black Queens football matches. The comparative then looks like, one, there is a lot of expectation for the Black Stars to literally perform. So it means that when women are performing and men are not performing, there is constantly going to be a backlash on the men's side for them to also perform. We think that the heavy investment solved that problem because, one, it gives them that infrastructure development, but most importantly, it pumps them into making sure that they are more effective in order for them to compete globally. Why is that important in the debate? Because the world is currently shifting towards women's football. We have a lot of viewership increments when it comes to women's sports that exist. What then that means in principle is that Africa, especially Ghana, wants to be a frontier when it comes to women's football. What then that means is that, one, when you invest at the frontier of women football, we think that in itself is something that government literally wants. But then let's engage the biggest case you get from all says that there's no return of investment when it comes to women's football because they think that the viewership is low, engagement is low. How do we solve that when we invest in women's like football, right? We think that when you invest in women's football, what you then do is that there's a lot of viewership because, one, the Black players start to like exceed in matches. They start to get the equipment that is necessary for them to participate and also exceed, right? What you then do is that there's a lot of recognition when it comes to the Black Queens. But secondly, things like media traction also exists. Now you get people talking about the Black Queens because now they are winning quarterfinals, they are winning semi-finals, and even winning finals in itself. What you then do is that a lot of merchandises are literally being purchased from these Black Queens. But secondly, that global viewership in itself gives them that level of sponsorship that they need to sustain at a longer run. We think that at that particular point in time, you still get that level of like investment that literally exists within that regard, right? We think that is something that matters a lot. Why is it important for social impact? We think that investment in the Black Queens pays off for the Ghanaian society in a couple of reasons. One, it expands the opportunity for women in sports nationwide. But secondly, it fixes massive disparities in pay, infrastructure, and development that exists. Thirdly, it creates role models for young girls, especially something Ghana's sporting culture desperately lacks. It seems like at that particular point in time, society then says that, women are performing. A girl who literally his dream is shattered because she thinks that she can literally grow up and become one of the women's big stars in football. We think that at that particular point in time, you give them an incentive to also emancipate their ambitions. Right now, Johnson, if you ask Johnson right now that he should mention 2 women players in the national team, he can't mention because he doesn't know them. We think that when you invest massively in this, it looks like the world where you bring out this team into the public eye. You make sure that people are able to engage. You make sure that you create a societal culture where women can emancipate themselves within football. This isn't charity. It is a force for multiplier. Every city spent on the Queen spills over into education, youth sports, and gender empowerment that exists. We think that meanwhile, investing more into the stars just repeats a broken cycle of entitlement, things like scandals that Griffith already proves, and inconsistency outputs within the men's side. We think that society gets more value per unit of investment. That's where rational governments put their money at. 4, we think there is a character of risk that exists. The biggest clash in this one is that these people say the Black Stars represent a high risk, low investment portfolio. But secondly, the Black Queens represent a low risk, high return portfolio. What we say is that they rely on legacy prestige and ignore empirical output. In a world of limited resources, the safer and more scalable ways is one that is literally effective and consistent. We've shown you why the Black Queens are the likelihood alternative to literally do that in the meanwhile, right? But most importantly, understand this. And this is the contention that we win the debate, right? We think that, one, Parliament revenues do not come as a giant check that enters the national budget. It is distributed in fragmented, oriented spaces, right? It looks like a world where, one, prize money goes to the GFA, not the National Treasury. It is sold by the Ghana Football Association, which then chooses how to allocate it across internal programs. We think also, most importantly, a large chunk of this becomes like A large chunk then becomes profit. It is immediately used to pay things like appearance fees and bonuses for players, things like travel and accommodation costs. We think these things are things that the women's sports literally lack at a longer run. Why is that important? Because, see, currently, the women are complaining. A lot of money has not been paid to them for their even participation. They are the people that have shown consistency, panel. So when you're going to vote for a world where these individuals have shown consistency needed to be rewarded at a longer run. But secondly, we show you the social impact on how this literally affects the Ghanaian community at a longer run. There is a principle and an extension that we win over opening opposition. And it's that one, the state has literally gatekeeped men's football. We show you why that is literally bad. It's in cases of scandal and corruption, and why we restructure that by using women's football to make sure that we solve the problem of men's football and leverage both sports in that regard. Ever proud to propose.
Thank you, Governor Whip, for that fine speech. Can we now have opposition to conclude the debate?
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right, so just give me some time to set my timer. I'll start this soon. All right, so I'm going to start.
Can check again.
All right, sure. All right, so I'm going to start my speech. You can ask POIs when the time is right. I'll prefer POIs in my 5th minute. Once I'm comfortable, I'll pick you. So, starting this debate in 3, 2, 1, go. Panel, this debate is not about whether the Black Queens deserve more investments because every single team on the opposition supports that rationally. The real question then is, should Ghana shift heavy national investment away from the Black Stars, which has always been the country's primary emotional institution, and redirect it exclusively to the Queens? Government has to prove that the gains from that shift outweigh the identity, the cohesion, and the stability consequences that we push back. What this debate becomes then is a sectoral success versus national stability. That is what we bring from you from CU. And closing opposition is the only thing that shows the historical, socio-political stakes of that particular trade-off in that regard. What has happened so far in this round? Let's look at opening government. I think OG does give you 2 claims. One is that the women's team is more consistent, so that's more return on investment. 2, they say the men's football is saturated, so marginal gains are lower. What's the problem with opening government? 2 things then. 1, we think they assume that football operates in a meritocracy vacuum, ignoring the global male-dominated infrastructure that still dictates sponsorship markets, tournament revenue, and competitive fine lines in that regard. Notice, they never even prove that increased funding leads to that guaranteed international success. Because notice, some women team like Cameroon, South Africa are actually more, like they have more funding than the Ghanaian team. But however, the Ghanaian team is outperforming them. It means that already in reality, teams that have more resources in that regard are like underperforming in that regard. They don't prove how that leads to guaranteed success in that regard. But let's look at opening opposition. I think opening opposition that gives you 2 major pieces. One is the fact that they give the necessity argument, where they tell you that the men's football requires higher budget structurally to even be competitive because the returns at the World Cup are higher, when they tell you the financial stakes. The second thing they tell you is the stardom argument, where the Black Stars maintain national relevance, global market visibility, and revenue in that regard. Of course, we do support OO, but what we do from our side is to amplify it. What we tell you is that, yes, they prove financial necessity. However, we prove that identity and stability necessity, which is the missing layer for any team to be able to win this on a large national level. If the system is capitalistic, we prove how we make it nationalistic in that regard. What O wins is the economics. What CO wins is the politics, the sociology, and the resilience in that regard. What does closing government give you? Let's take them out of the debate. think Sinji gives you one big make, which is to say that institutional capture, that the men's side has corrupt gatekeepers. So shifting attention to the queens, avoid this particular corruption and increases accountability. What has been our response then? Three things. One, we don't think capture is about access, that these guys do not have access to these systems. It's not about gender. If you move money, the same actors follow the money. The same administrators with the political capital, the networks, the first mover advantage, simply switch institutions. If you cannot hold them accountable now, like the funny thing they next say is that, well, when we move them, like when we move the funds there, they will now begin to hold them accountable. No, Meg, if you cannot hold them, if we were not able to hold them accountable and they'll be so corrupt and they have held the system back, how can you then hold them accountable later? Capture is portable, corruption is portable. So their only piece of new contribution collapses on these four like responses I've given you in that regard. What has been the closing up opposition case, the decisive reason why we win this debate? I bring into you the largest comparative in the debate, the one that shifts this from a sports debate to a national survival debate. What does my partner tell you? A, he tells you that Ghana is entering one of the most socially fragile periods in its democratic history. Three forces are converging. One, record inflation, youth unemployment, collapsing trust in most state institutions. This means that these are the exact structural preconditions that create four things then: polarization, ethnic bloc formation, religious re-entrenchment, anger against the political class. This is not theoretical. Every Ghanaian on this call knows that that's what is happening right now. The B tells you that in such periods, society survives because of stability institutions. A stability institution is one that is able to do four things as it tells you. One, generate nationwide emotional investment. Two, transcend political and ethnic divides. Three, provide collective catharsis during hardship. But four, remind citizens that they belong to one nation, one Ghana. The Black Stars are the single strongest one Ghana that has. Why? Because of four things it tells you. 70 years of emotional archives of successes, a shared national heartbreak and miracles. Because notice, we have already been seeing banners like, let's support Black Stars again. It means that people are already losing trust in this mood of this thing. What this policy does is that we particularly collapse that national identity and cohesion that we attach to most of these Black teams like the Black Stars in that regard. What we do is that you cannot artificially recreate this. You cannot buy it with new funding. The identity institutions are historical and not manufactured. The queens, of course, we love them, but they do not yet have that nationwide emotional archive. The comparative harm is that if we defund this Black Stars, if you shift that national attention and investment from this anchor, two things happen. You create an identity vacuum. People do not stop needing collective emotional experiences, but when those disappear, they retreat into one, ethnic affiliation, they retreat into political party identity and most religious blocs. We think these are divisive and not unifying to a large extent. Two, you intensify the social fragmentation that exists within most of these states. What it does is that when a economic frustration has no national outlet, it becomes things like anger, cynicism, tribalism, populist mobilization. This is the exact danger point where Ghana reaches when you do this. Investing heavily in the Queen cannot substitute for this identity function because emotional institutions take decades of years to form. This is CO's unique extension that my partner has told you. We defend the national cohesion and not just sports performance in that regard. What is the way up and why CO beats all teams in today's debate? Before that, shoot. Quick.
Your case draws a huge logical leap. I mean, Ghana doesn't fall apart into civil war just because the teams don't do well in the environment. Like, this is a very huge impact. You need to prove the steps.
Bro, I don't think you are being fair to us to say this is like a huge mechanistic leap. Because we've already proven to you how for years the identity of like Ghana and mixed people have been tied to this, and how we, like when we enter into World Cup, the nation, everybody making noise, everybody's watching on their TV, shouting out, oh, we have won, we scored, Ghana is ahead, etc. When we come down, all that kind of unity, all people gathering up in shops to watch these things. Like, bro, that's what we told you. At the point where you move that funding, already they're not performing. So Ghana now, most like NGOs are now saying, lifting up banners, they're starting hashtags, support Ghana now, let's bring the love back, etc. And all these things are happening. It means that at the point where you move that funding, they continually like don't even qualify for the World Cup, don't even qualify for AFCON and most of these things. When that happens, I think that that kind of identity of itself is much more like fragmented to a large extent. Why? What is the way up? Even if they say their performance, like even if they say like they give you performance gains from the female side, the performance is sexual. The impact is limited to sports. The benefit is marginal. The reason why we win is because we've been able to give you we've been able to bring the nation together for national cohesion and stability to a large extent, to which like the impact on the other edge or on the flip side is particularly harmful in that regard. We have been the only team that has been able to show you like the major issues in today's debate. We've never been proud to break from this room as the first team. Thank you.
Thank you, Upwood, for that fine speech. We have now come to the end of the quarterfinals for this room. Will the panelists kindly join me on Discord in deliberation room 1 so that we can have a discussion? That being said,